folks, welcome to Thinking Theology. I'm Don, where I take a look at theological arguments, and that includes anti-theological arguments, right? You got to state the problem in order to refute it. So atheistic arguments, completely on the table. I'll take a look at, as I have, say, Kenneth Copeland's Prosperity Gospel, give my thoughts on it. I do have an extensive theological background, though I am squarely in the agnostic camp, and my general disposition is I could be wrong on anything I think, as my ex-wife reminded me once. It was a very good insult, by the way, but it's true. Any of us could be wrong on anything we're thinking. We may be missing pieces of the puzzle. When people used to get sick prior to penicillin and the understanding of germs, they did not know what was causing it, and it was unfathomable to them to think that something so tiny could be wreaking havoc on the human body and killing people. Eventually, they discovered it, and that's sort of how I approach anything. If there's a God, then great. The texts don't do it for me. The biblical text. So that's a little background on me, but I leave the door open. There might be, and there may not be. I'm pretty comfortable in either camp, so I straddle the fence. So thinking theology is not about establishing theology. It's just about looking at theological arguments, and then I give my assessment. So we're going to look at Jordan Peterson's, I grabbed this off the YouTube, off the net, and just what is God? That's how it was titled. So that's an interesting question. And let's see what old Jordan has to say about this one. I like Jordan. I do. Of course, I don't agree with him on everything. That would be impossible.
One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence.
Yeah.
But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else.
That Plato actually posited that in one sense in his World of the Forms, and Plato was back around 350 BC or BCE. So that wasn't a new idea that Christians came up with.
Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union, and what happened in Maoist China, and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So
I guess he's teaching
for
in
example,
Canada
very
here.
briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins, but that's not so good, because well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space, but from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them, and you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B, and then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too, and so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names, at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive, and you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract that covers both of us if we can do it.
That's the nature of just human development, if you will. We take thoughts and then we infuse them into other thoughts, and it's really the nature of an argument where you take this premise, that premise, then you've got a conclusion based on those two. That conclusion becomes a premise in the next part of your argument as you're developing it. And the acquisition of knowledge either forces you to jettison prior premises and conclusions or to continue building on them. That's what a theory is. A theory isn't that which is merely possible. It is that. But a theory, the definition of a theory is that which a body of knowledge is built upon, a basic foundation upon which a theory of knowledge or a body of knowledge in a specific field is built upon. Einstein's theory of relativity, that word theory, most people take it to mean, oh, it's just guesswork. Well, it doesn't mean guesswork. There is initially some involved in it, but a theory, a well-established theory, is one in which they've yet to find flaws with. But this is how things develop, where this group talks with this group. In this context, it's religion or deities trying, and different populations trying to work well together. He used commerce or trade in this example, which, if you are listening and paying attention to human nature, it really is about comfort. It's not as much about religion as it is about each of us being comfortable with where we are in the world. And we like to be surrounded by people generally who provide somewhat of an echo chamber for us instead of challenging us on ideas. But we first need living situations. We need food. We need sustenance, presumably safety for our families. And this would be true in all eras because animals do the same thing. They find their comfort zones. They find sources of food and they go to them. Folks frequently look at the idea, and this is from an atheistic perspective, and I've addressed this on the channel, that if we eradicated religion, then there would be far fewer deaths, maybe no deaths. Everybody would be singing Kumbaya, and they wouldn't. Religion frequently is the fall guy for certain aspects, but there are a lot of deaths and wars fought over land, over money, over natural resources, or on a much more localized level. I've used the Bloods and the Crips as an example. They're not fighting over religion. They're fighting over territory. People are out to make their money. That's where he used the trade example as one, and that is to produce a certain measure of income for your family or your people. But let's see where else he goes. Jordan speaks a million miles. He speaks faster than I do.
One of the things that's really interesting about Marduk, I'll just give you a couple of his features, but he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god, so that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out and when he fights this deity called Tiamat. And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, Tehom, and Theom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic St. George story. Go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world out of her pieces. And that's the world that human beings live in. And the Mesopotamian emperor acted out Marduk. He was allowed to be emperor insofar as he was a good Marduk. And so that meant that he had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic. He could speak properly. And so that we're starting to understand there at that point the essence of leadership, right? Because what's leadership?
It's like television. If you've got your emperor that you crowned a deity, it's sort of this willful suspension of disbelief. It's like when we watch a movie where we're looking at scenes playing out. We're like, well, we know it wouldn't happen exactly like that, but for the purpose of the story, we suspend our disbelief and go along with it. It's sort of like fantasy-like. And that's how I see this. This is like real-life television where you say, okay, this guy's got eyes around his head. My emperor or my leader is in North Korea, Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il. They are taught, trained to revere their leader. And there's no outside information that they have access to. There's no internet there in North Korea. And they truly believe that their leader, because they are constantly told, and it's just so embedded in their psyches from a young age, that their leader is everything, and he is keeping their country and the American dogs, he's keeping them out. He's their grand leader. Well, they have no access to outside information, and so they believe that he is a god, that he could read their minds. If you read and listen to the accounts of people who have escaped North Korea, which is remarkably few because they don't allow them to escape, or when they escape to China, and China will send them back if they catch them. So it's very arduous, but some have and have shared what's going on inside there and the perspectives of the populace of their grand leader. For them, it's not a willful suspension of disbelief. It's a threat of death, starvation, which they're starving anyway. They believe that their leader is keeping them. In other places where there is access to information, then it becomes a willful suspension of disbelief if you think that your leaders are gods or deities or what have you. But this sort of scenario that Jordan just spoke about reminds me remarkably, psychologically, of the willful suspension of disbelief when we're watching television or the movies, where we're like, that's not really true, but I'll go along with it. But at some point, I guess if you repeat something long enough, people will believe it. Or if you stand in one spot long enough, a line will form behind you. All right, let's listen to a little bit more Jordan, see where he goes.
The capacity to see what the hell's in front of your face and maybe in every direction, and then the capacity to use your language properly in a transformative manner and to transform chaos into order. And God only knows how long it took the Mesopotamians to figure that out, and the best they could do is dramatize it, but it's staggeringly brilliant. You know, it's by no means obvious, and this chaos is a very strange thing, and this is the chaos that God wrestled with at the beginning of time. Chaos is it's half psychological and half real. There's no other way to really describe it.
Yeah.
The chaos is what you encounter when you're thrown into deep confusion. Right? When your world falls apart, when you encounter something that blows you into pieces, when your dreams die, when you're betrayed, it's the chaos that emerges. And the chaos is everything at once, and it's too much for you. And that's for sure. And it pulls you down into the underworld. And that's where the dragons are. And all you've got at that point is your capacity to bloody well keep your eyes open and to speak as carefully and clearly as you can. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get through it that way and come out the other side. And it's taken people a very long time to figure that out. And it looks to me like the idea is erected on the platform of our ancient ancestors, maybe tens of millions of years ago, because we seem to represent that which disturbs us deeply using the same system that we use to represent like serpentile or other carnivorous predators. You know, we're biological creatures, right? So when we've formulated our capacity to abstract, our strange capacity to abstract and use language, we still have all those underlying systems that were there when we were only animals. And we have to use those systems. They're part of the emotional and motivational architecture of our thinking. And part of the reason we can demonize our enemies who upset our axioms is because we perceive them as if they're carnivorous predators. We do it with the same system. And that's chaos itself, the thing that always threatens.
I think Kahneman and Tversky referred to that as system 1 and system 2, in a sense. 1 is immediate, and 2 is a little bit more deliberate. All right, let's continue.
Us, right? The snakes that came to the trees when we lived in them like 60 million years ago. It's the same damn systems. So the Marduk story is partly the story of using attention and language to confront those things that most threaten us. And some of those things are real world threats, but some of them are psychological threats, which are just as profound but far more abstract. But we use the same systems to represent them. It's why you freeze if you're frightened, right? You're a prey animal. You're like a rabbit. You've seen something that's going to eat you. You freeze. And that way you're paralyzed. You're turned to stone, which is what you do when you see a Medusa with a head full of snakes, right? You're turned to stone. You're paralyzed. And the reason you do that is because you're using the predator detection system to protect yourself. Your heart rate goes way up, and you get ready to move. Things that upset us rely on that system. And then the Marduk story, for example, is the idea that if there are things that upset you, chaotic, terrible, serpentine, monstrous, underworld things that threaten you, the best thing to do is to open your eyes and get your speech organized and go out and confront the thing and make the world out of it. And it's staggering. When I read that story and started to understand it, just blew me away that it's such a profound idea, and we know it's true too, because we know in psychotherapy, for example, that you're much better off to confront your fears head on than you are to wait and let them find you. And so partly what you do if you're a psychotherapist is you help people break their fears into little pieces, the things that upset them, and then to encounter them one by one and master them. And so you're teaching this process of eternal mastery over the strange and chaotic world. And that all of that makes up some of the background. We haven't even got to the first sentence of the biblical stories yet. But
we're waiting on this. Let's see where
But all of that makes up the background. So you have to think that we've extracted this story, this strange collection of stories with all its errors and its repetitions and its peculiarities out of the entire history that we've been able to collect ideas. And it's the best we've been able to do. And I know there are other religious traditions. I'm not concerned about that at the moment because we can use this as an example, but it's the best we've been able to do. And what I'm hoping is that we can return to the stories in some sense with an open mind and see if there's something there that we actually need.
All right, so he didn't really get to it. He was building on it. This was a lecture. Evidently, I know prior to him becoming more like a worldwide figure, based on one video that he had done, and it went viral, and then things took off. That dynamic. Prior to that, he was a professor. I don't know what university. I don't know if it was in Ottawa or if it was probably Toronto. I'm going to guess. But he didn't really get to it. He was laying the background of the mythology and so forth about what is God. But he was kind of all over the map in this one. But that is part of, in a sense, laying the foundation for the future ideas he was going to borrow from. But for me, I got basically what he's getting at is the willful suspension of disbelief. He's probably not going to go there. That was an idea that I gleaned from where he was going. And when we deify human beings, which is one of the problems that I know Jews, for example, have with Judaism, and Jews are opposed to the notion of Jesus being a God and man. And that's an idea that I find ridiculous as well, too, because what we posit about God and what we posit about man are divergencies, and they're inconsistent. But these are all ideas these are attributes that we assign. And depending on who you are and where you come from and what you're willing to assign to another, that's going to determine whether or not it's inconsistent or not. I find them inconsistent. I mean, the notions that we have of God. I'm not saying I believe in God. I'm not saying I don't. I leave the door open to there being more proof to God being what the Christian tradition says. He's paying attention, he cares, he's loving, he's all powerful and all this stuff while the world winds down. All that said, what we attribute to God, what we attribute to man are two different things in the most elemental, rudimentary cases. And the idea that Jesus, for example, would be God and man just is like what? Or the doctrine of the Trinity, that there are three co-equal, co-eternal persons in the Godhead, yet there's only one God. Three persons, but one God. It's a most enigmatic idea. I doubt Jordan and the rest of this lecture went to that place, but he might have, because it's certainly fertile material to go there. But borrowing from mythological conceptions of God to get into, I don't think he's trying to establish in this class here that there is a God. I don't think he's defending God. I don't think he's defending the Christian God, so to speak, which I do believe he believes in, which I have no problem with. I don't care what someone believes. As long as they're a decent person, I'm cool with that. But he's borrowing from mythology, maybe moving forward, and you're going to walk into problems with that if you're trying to establish a belief. Maybe he's just going after why humans have arrived at this belief in God, the Christian tradition, but I'm not quite sure. So anyway, folks, leave your thoughts, subscribe if you haven't. We can move this thing along. We can have civil discourse on the matter of atheism, theism, religion, whatever it may be, and human decency. All right, guys, have a great day. See you on another video, and keep thinking theology.